we're all here in terms of our critic list. So without too much further ado, I'd like to just maybe introduce everyone so we can have the most of this time. I know that we're squeezing in, of course, between other reviews and other schedules. So thanks to all the critics very much for joining. Of course, I think you all know me, but my name's Nick Bruscia. My fellow committee is Steph Kramer. Steph is up there, and Laura Craning. Laura teaches in the media study department, and Steph in the architecture department. So joining us today from the internal side is Mark Shepard and Albert Chow, the super duper and the ever clever. And it just came up, sorry. Joining us from outside is Shadi Nazarian. I'm very happy to introduce Shadi to everyone today. Shadi is a colleague of ours from UB for many years, and also now an associate professor of architecture at Penn State University, who gave us a very short introduction to some amazing things she's currently working on. As a matter of fact, has a very serious deadline within 48 hours. So thanks so much for being here to join. Also, Stephen Chodarewski. Stephen is currently a visiting assistant professor at the University of Utah and a very recent Banham Fellow here at Buffalo, and a good friend to us all. Stephen, wonderful as always to have you join. And Sean Cheeky. So Sean is a relatively recent graduate, but also a manufacturing engineer at TCH here locally, but also a multimedia artist who works with a variety of different media, sometimes digital, sometimes music. And I've been a big fan of Sean's work for a while now. It'll be very, I think, interesting to have the three of you join us today. In addition to our two internals. So without any more from me, I'd like to pass it on now to Sakina to introduce us to her directed research.
Thank you. So let me share my screen first. Okay, so my title is Dystopian Visions, and my abstract is this research will start by analyzing imagined cities in dystopian films by exploring both production design and existing architectural space in cinema. Further analysis will examine the behavioral and psychological aspects of that portrayal to discuss how the feeling of dystopia is created as a reframing of the existing built environment. The real and the imagined are constantly informing and transforming each other, and the fundamental way we make sense of the future is through imagination. This research explores imaginative modes of thinking, strictly dystopian, in relation to future cities, in response to climate change, social division, and ruination. The goal is to reveal essential ways in which imagination impacts how we might think through the urban future. So just to mention, I first analyzed 18 films and made kind of this catalog for my midterm packet. The films were The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, La Inhumane, Aelita, Queen of Mars, Metropolis, Just Imagine, Alphaville, Playtime, 2001: A Space Odyssey, A Clockwork Orange, Blade Runner, 1984, Brazil, Batman, 12 Monkeys, Equilibrium, Dread, High Rise, and Blade Runner 2049. And I first was very interested in production design, but I soon became even more interested in the science fiction narratives themselves in dystopian images. I traced some recurring features that characterize all dystopian narratives. So what makes a stereotypical dystopian world? The dystopian genre imagines worlds or societies where life is extremely bad, uncomfortable, and repressed due to either environmental destruction, government control, technological control, survival, loss of individualism. That said, the critical category of dystopia as applied to the study of architecture is in fact completely hypothetical. So first, I wanted to do the notion of density. So for instance, in 2017's Blade Runner 2049, the rich live in what seem to be garden city typologies, where the poor live in rundown LA. The scene was shot using special effects software, while the flying car was an actual miniature model made against a green screen. You also have vertical density, like in 1927's Metropolis, similarly plays on the social division, having the wealthy live in the city above and the poor living in the city below, what is called the land of the machines. The Tower of Babel, as imagined in Metropolis, was hand-painted, while the rest of the set used miniature models made by hand. The filmmakers used stop motion to create this scene. You also have a lot of trash. So the Trash Maze in Blade Runner 2049 is actually thousands of miniature pieces shown as a set with added CGI to the flying structures. You also have raw spaces. So throughout its existence, brutalist architectural design has been linked with low-cost construction, decay of the urban space, and failed social experiments. Its lack of ornament is true vision of the future, one that has been shown numerous times in science fiction films, in which everything kind of blends together, becoming invisible in everyday life, which is evident in 2002's Equilibrium, a film about repressing individual emotions. These scenes were entirely shot using special effects. You also have vertical density again, like in 2012's Dread, which takes place almost entirely in peach trees, a housing complex that can be characterized as a city in itself. The inside of the city block was built while the outside used CGI. The term salvage punk is a stylized setting that focuses on technological and culture based on an unusual source, scavenged junk. Weapons, tools, clothing, and sometimes entire cities will be built out of repurposed recycled materials, like the one shown in WALL-E. This is evident in also 1995's 12 Monkeys and zombie films like 2002's 28 Days Later. Speaking of, 28 Days Later uses trash as weapons, but what's even more visually appealing is abandoned London. The filmmakers shot the scene by closing off the busiest street in London at sunrise for an hour or so every day and simply decorated the streets with trash, similarly to 1971's A Clockwork Orange. You also have scale that plays a huge factor in dystopian films. So architecture sets the mood for a scene, so it's no surprise dystopian films use massive architectural spaces to make you feel extremely small. Out-of-scale architecture promotes a paranoid search for individuality, like the space is consuming you into their world. The massiveness of some of these sets achieve this feeling like 1985's Brazil, which is actually an abandoned water tank in real life. Some films also use over-sexualized spaces to make you feel uncomfortable. So like 1971's A Clockwork Orange, they over-sexualize spaces by having women acting as furniture. As mentioned, the dystopian genre could be formed from technological control, which is clear in 1965's Alphaville. During the scene, Lemmy is speaking to Alpha 60, a dictatorial computer system that was shot in an existing building, an existing radio tower building. You also have reformative spaces. So since dystopian films are often about loss of individualism, many of these films have the main character encountering prison-like spaces like A Clockwork Orange, Brazil, and 12 Monkeys, which this was inspired by Labius Wood's architectural drawing. These spaces have the subject either in the center of a circle or elevated to heighten the notion of surveillance. And speaking of surveillance, like in this scene in 1984, this was shot in an old massive bunker while Big Brother kind of watches over everyone. You also have endless space. So often there is an illusion done through post-processing to give the appearance of endless space in dystopian films. As the space seamlessly appears to go on forever, this gives a feeling of uncertainty in Blade Runner 2049 and a chaotic, overwhelming feeling in Brazil. 12 Monkeys also uses a lot of found objects clustered together to create new objects like the scientist table seen here. In fictions like The Handmaid's Tale by Canadian author Margaret Atwood is set in the near future New England in a strongly patriarchal, totalitarian state known as Gilead. This has overthrown the United States government. Filming took place at real locations in Canada, and most of these films, but they simply don't film the existing environment as is. They often desaturate the existing world. So you could see on the top is an image from The Handmaid's Tale, but on the bottom is the building in real life. And this just gives the illusion that these new worlds are like colder than they actually are. And the same set is used, the same notion is used in 1984 as well, with desaturating the real world. A Clockwork Orange films the real world as well, but like I mentioned earlier, they just simply decorate it with trash and graffiti to create, to make it the space look less formal. You could also transform the space by using dark spaces, like Blade Runner, how it transforms the Bradbury building from an architectural masterpiece to a vertical corridor of surprises that can only be seen when a beam of light comes across the screen. A Clockwork Orange also filmed at night to darken the existing images of the real world, making them appear more mysterious and creepy. So can we imagine our own spaces as dystopian? What would these spaces look like aged 1,000 years? Will the walls rot and become overgrown with vegetation? Will dust fill the air as you walk through these spaces? Will urban explorers tag everything in sight? So I focused on 3 main themes moving forward. So the first was the unmade city, which is the ruination of cities and salvaging what's left. The unmoored city, which is adaptable cities in regards to climate change, and the vertical city, which is heightened social division. So for the unmade city, the built environment is always on the verge of ruin. Architects and urban planners have no choice but to develop a receptiveness towards destruction and ruin in the built environment. This is a painting by John Soane's Bank of England, brilliantly imagined by one of his draftsperson, Joseph Gandy. The painting shows a ruined and almost castle-like depiction of what the famous bank may one day turn into, which is a timeless ruin. You also have deliberately like half ruined, half constructed pieces like Deanna Petherbridge's Ribbon City. This form attempts to represent the patterns of destruction and preservation that infuse all buildings and cities. And you also have entropy, which entropy suggests that ruins are always present and also that ruined is a process rather than an object, a verb rather than a noun. Entropic decay also is significant in post-war science fiction films and novels. Their future sprawling cities are often overflowing with the discarded junk of the past. For instance, do androids dream of electric sheep, which was the inspiration for Blade Runner? Everything is slowly being taken over by what is termed the kipple, the accumulated waste or debris of any kind that will eventually consume everything. In Blade Runner, it is translated into J.F. Sebastian's apartment, where he has reanimated discarded toys as equivalents of the kipple, which essentially fosters timescales beyond the lifespan of the individual human. Salvage can provide many alternative ways of engaging within the city. Urban waste of all kind might be incorporated back into construction as a way of radically changing architecture tendencies to take more from the earth than it gives. Integrating waste into architecture might produce future cities of rich potential that expand how we think about what cities are actually made out of. The waste is being transformed rather than simply rejected. We might instead produce valueless products such as instruments used in 12 Monkeys, again inspired by Lebbeus Wood's work, or Mad Max Fury Road. The term salvage punk is a practice that rests on the idea that in the waste of the world lie the shattered utopian dreams of the past, which are waiting to be unlocked once again. Even if our future cities end up as ruined wastelands, as countless post-apocalyptic fictions have imagined, they might still provide a basis on which to build more hopeful futures. For in the waste of our cities lie lost dreams. So I traveled to an abandoned silo to get a sense of what feeling is created when entering such a dystopian, ruined place in real life. And for number one, I felt very uncomfortable, kind of like I was being watched in a way. When I walked through it, you could hear my footsteps echoing from inside the grain silos. And the outside was deserted as well. The deterioration and ruin of old silos became very apparent. I felt like the roof was going to collapse on me. And I kept inhaling dirt coming up from underneath me that hadn't been walked on in days, maybe even months. So how could I recreate this feeling in world building exercises? I found this great short film called Megalomania by Jonathan Gaines from Factory 15, which is a short film of dystopian cities that has been emptied, where architecture is in the state of incompletion. The following slides are excerpts taken from the film. Megalomania exaggerates the time lag between a building's construction and completion in order to flag up how vulnerable architecture is to fluctuations in the flows of global capital. We see that ruins present a whole host of potential metaphors that inspire and disturb in equal measure. Ruins might also be lived in as architecture entities in their own right, Ruins and waste must be accepted in order to be transformed. The short film I found to be very inspiring. I was actually really interested in the animation of this, as it was constructed in 3D modeling softwares like Cinema 4D or Blender. So I started to research more on the tools of the trade as well. So this is a city I created using the City Builder add-on in Blender, which had basically preloaded texture buildings. Then using the particle settings, I was able to scatter and scale each individual building however I wanted to. This is, for instance, an apocalyptic future where humans have died away due to a chemical leak, leaving the city abandoned. These buildings are starting to rot and become overgrown with dying vegetation, as what is left is the mere footprint of trash left behind by humans. The chemicals stain the building and make it impossible for any human being to enter to try to repair it. With little hope of restoration, the world is simply left to die. And second, you have the unmoored city. So when thinking of the future, one must also consider climate change. At one extreme, you have a future where Earth becomes extremely colder, like Snowpiercer, and on the other, when Earth becomes drastically warmer. For instance, it's 2031, 17 years after a failed global warming experiment. A backfiring attempt to lower the global temperature has left the planet completely frozen and killed most of the population. The only survivors live on the train that circled the world every year. There's a class struggle simultaneously going on in the film. The poor live in the tail section while the rich flourish with amenities in the guest room section. Snowpiercer's train sections were created in the studio space to create this dystopia. It's based on the 1982 graphic novel Les Transpersonnages by Jacques Loeb, Benjamin Legrand, and Jean-Marc Ragetti. The Day After Tomorrow is another film that follows this extreme. So for instance, a massive storm system develops in the Northern Hemisphere, splitting into a gigantic hurricane-like superstorm above Canada. The storm pulls frozen air from the upper stratosphere into the center, flash freezing anything caught in the eye, with temperatures below 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Unlike Snowpiercer though, the film mainly used special effects through programs like Blender and Cinema 4D combined with real actors in front of a blue screen. So as you could see in this animation, all the water is created digitally. The buildings were also made digitally. The people added in the background are all digital, and they simply added the real life people in front to create the scene you're seeing. Man is a creature of hope, cunning and delusional. Waste the planet, find an escape, or in biblical terms, endure banishment from the Garden of Eden. This is the theme of 2014's Interstellar, when a team of astronauts seek a wormhole in space to deliver humanity from the shriveled crops, blowing dust, and the environment catastrophe Earth has become. It seems our ingenuity to find someplace new is stronger and more fierce than it is in fixing the planet we are in. We didn't run out of planes and television sets, says one character. We ran out of food. On the other end of the extreme, there's Earth overheating, essentially melting the ice caps and flooding mainland. Such a topic is explored in Waterworld, where the entire city is submerged and people must survive on boats and floating cities. Waterworld was the most expensive movie ever made at the time it was produced. The movie cost an unprecedented $175 million to make, shooting in a large water enclosure off the coast of Hawaii on elaborate real-life floating sets. The massive floating set that much of the movie takes place on cost roughly $22 million to create. The structure was 1/4 of a mile in circumference and weighed over 1,000 tons. Sea levels will rise by anything up to a meter or more if current predictions prove to be over-optimistic. For instance, New York City 2140, sea levels are estimated to rise over 49 feet. So what would this city look like? So for instance, this is a 3D model created by Hermiendo Nieves. This is Waterworld 2140, created in a 3D modeling software, and I exported it as an object file to be rendered in V-Ray. Here, the ice caps have melted and flooded the mainland. We are forced to compete with each other and to live in the vertical skyscrapers connected by buoyant support systems. the city adapts to climate change, remaining firmly grounded in instrumental thinking, rather adaptation of the built fabric through long-term strategic planning or reshaping of urban governance and socio-political life towards sustainable ends. Climate change fictions like that imagine future drowned cities invite multiple ways of working through possible apocalyptic scenarios. In this scenario, these three structures offer a utopian way of living, leaving most of the population to scavenge for food in the open water, similar to Waterworld. Climate change fictions also point to the need for human imagination to think through adapting to the future effects of climate change, something that tends to be sidelined in scientific climate discourse with its focus on mitigation. And lastly, you have the vertical city. So the vertical city has somewhat of a visual dominance and isolation that goes along with it. The skyscraper city is one that entered fully into urban life as a built reality for well over a century, with over 70 tall skyscrapers being built from 2001 to 2016, and 3 megatall buildings were created. According to geographer Maria Kakai, luxury skyscrapers like the one in High Rise are an autistic architecture in that they exhibit a pathological self-absorption that serves them from the outside world. High-rise ends with social disintegration spreading outward from the skyscraper's interior. Skyscrapers are increasingly becoming enlivened by special effects, particularly sophisticated lighting at night or images projected onto their surfaces, either to advertise products or mark the occasion of a special event, like the one shown in Blade Runner. The mediated nature of contemporary skyscrapers feeds into imaginative visions of vertical urban landscapes in cinema. Dystopian fictions of the 1970s might also contribute to more recent ideological and literal running down of high-rise social housing, rather than offering insights into the neglect of social housing by irresponsible construction firms and municipal authorities. It might also be argued that the horizontal buildings would never be this spatially limited in reality, but the illustration serves to reveal just how different the vertical built environment is from the rest of the city. On the ground, cities offer an interconnection of streets, while in the vertical city, those interconnections are always much more limited and usually heavily prescribed. Building vertically will always mean a reduction of urban interconnectedness, like China's CCTV building, which tries to bridge this gap between, creating its own interconnection at the very height of the building, which was something I wanted to carry on into the next world building exercise. So for instance, this is Buffalo 2159, where the rich live in ginormous towers that connect to one another, and the poor live on the lower floors. The model was again created by Herminio Nieves, which he created this in a 3D modeling software, and I exported it as an object to be animated. Yeah. So in Hollywood, a dystopia or a lens into the future. The world in these fictions is dark and unredemptive. The steady drumbeat of reports from our best and brightest scientists has made it explicitly clear that whether we like it or not, or we have damaged our planet in ways that have transformed us into a dystopian topos. Journalist Jeanette Diaz said in a podcast with Boston Review, "We are making the genre in which we are living, and we are making it at such an extraordinary rate." So just to cover again, I first analyzed 18 films and made a catalog of my observations in my midterm packet. I was interested in production design, but I soon became more interested in creating dystopian images. I traced some recurring features that characterize all dystopian narratives. By doing this, I created a filter for the real environment of Hayes Hall and the grain silos. I then continued researching fictional worlds and was able to experiment with world building in Blender and Rhino and animate these new worlds. Moving forward, I would like to focus on the unmade city, which focuses on the ruination of cities and salvaging what's left, and continue experimenting with these special effects programs and creating my own images of the new world. For the imagination can be a powerful tool for articulating radical new possibilities for urban life in the face of equally radical uncertain futures. that's it.
Great, thank you, Sakina.
Thank you.
Sakina, are you a double major? Are
No,
you
I'm
both in architecture? Are you?
no,
Okay, so you're in media studies,
or
right?
no, I'm in architecture.
Architecture. Okay, I was just trying to figure that out.
Yes.
Yeah, and just for a quick note, I probably should have referred to this earlier, but this is one semester of a 2-semester long thesis, but this is the directed research semester. So Shadi, as you might remember, we have a kind of a 1-semester process, and then after that, so this process is really about defining what the thesis is and putting out some ideas about how the thesis will be, what the methodologies are and how it will be acted on, and we can discuss that. Toward the end of this conversation, we'll ask everyone to leave, and just the faculty and the guests will remain, and we'll discuss that next step.
So what are some of the methodologies that you might imagine you'll continue this research during the next term that you would use?
I think definitely I was more interested in looking up like the tools of the trade. So like special effects softwares, and just researching those more. Other than that, my methodology has kind of stayed the same from the beginning, where I basically watch films, analyze them, and take any like dystopian qualities that I see in creating and use that to create my own like presentation, my own world building.
What are some of the contributions to the discipline that you might imagine having?
Could you be more specific?
I'm just wondering if you may have some thoughts, projections, ideas about how this exercise, how this year-long thesis, which is very, very interesting and timely, could influence your future practice as an architect, as well as the future of the discipline.
Yeah, I mean, I think we as architects, we take a lot from media. So definitely like films like Blade Runner, like they definitely set the mood for architecture at the time. So I think the two kind of go hand in hand with each other. So if you study films, you're kind of studying architecture as well.
So I can imagine, for example, the films that you have studied would propel a certain kind of architectural investigation. And I wonder if now in turn, your architectural thesis might influence the film industry to reimagine or to imagine futures that they haven't yet imagined.
Mhm.
So
Right.
one affects the other, and together they would really push us forward much faster than if we were to work alone. And I think this interconnectivity between disciplines is not only essential, but it really, really affects the amount of progress in each discipline. So, yeah.
I'd like to just carry on with that, because I think those are important, points. This relationship between film and architecture, it seems to hover around this notion of the imaginary, which you point out, and thinking about how you can specify what form this takes in terms of the thesis. There are kind of three references that immediately come to mind, and I'd like to just quickly introduce these into the conversation. I think the first is, and maybe what I should probably do is add these to the chat so you can refer to these later rather than having to Google them now. But the first is Robert Smithson's project, Hotel Palenque, and it's basically consists of a slide lecture of a photograph of a hotel in Mexico that he discovered, which was simultaneously in the process of it was a kind of ruin which was being renovated, right? And so now Smithson, in a series of slides, gives a lecture to a series of architecture students, actually, and discusses this in terms of a context of architecture sort of disassembling itself, right? And so to the extent that you're thinking about and talking about this idea of or urban environments which are kind of simultaneously being evacuated and sort of re-inhabiting them in a certain way, the sort of Smithson's sort of tongue-in-cheek ambiguity between the sort of value systems in play in terms of the ruin and the renovation is something which I think you might focus on, because the dystopic always carries with it as a sort of a kind of a reflection, the utopic, right? And so the value systems are going to become really important here. The next reference then is a book by McLean Clutter, who's the chair at University of Michigan. And the book is titled Imaginary Apparatus, New York City and its Mediated Representation. And so to the extent that you're looking forward in terms of the relationship between film and architecture, this is a reference which looks kind of historically backwards, right, in terms of New York City and its kind of long-standing relationship to the production of film, and how this sort of, we kind of occupy the imaginary of urbanism through projections of the filmic imaginary. And then finally, are you familiar with the work of Liam Young?
No, I'm not.
Okay, you have to check him out.
Okay.
Because Liam directs a master's program at SciArc in architecture. He's originally based in London. He's pretty much taught in a number of different places. But his thing is looking at the kind of future dystopia of cities and representing them in these kind of extremely detailed and very sophisticated renderings. He produces films primarily, so these cities that he's imagining are shot as if they were sort of, in many cases, filmic backdrops, but in some cases explicitly filmed. So, for example, I think, In the Robot Skies is something you might want to kind of take a look at in terms of an architect looking toward the practice of filmmaking and how that can be appropriated to comment back on the kind of future of architecture and kind of influencing the future of architecture. So yeah, just three references immediately came to mind in terms of this turn that I've seen since the midterm, which you presented, and we were talking more about kind of set design, to where you are now, which I find much more kind of provocative and interesting and imaginative, for all the reasons that Shadi just mentioned in terms of what it sets you up to say and do vis-a-vis the kind of larger discourse of architecture.
Thank you.
Hello, I unmuted. So is any of this a bit of like trying to find out what is like the ugly future, so that as like that the real architects would make all of the opposite choices in the future? Like, is there any truth to that, or?
I didn't really think about that. But it's kind of like a pessimistic view of the future. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean, like I'm 100% for using art and media and film and stories to provide like targets for the real world to shoot for. But like in this instance, it's like, yeah, it's pessimistic, it's negative. So like, are we going like, yeah, let's all go down the dark hole of it? Like, right, because like, we wouldn't want to actually live in that place, right? Like, but it's still like an interesting study. I'm wondering of like, as far as like your next moves and like where you're going with it, are you more interested in doing like detailed, precise, either renderings or like representations or just like really thought out of like, yeah, with the details, or are you looking to capture the feelings?
Probably capture the feelings more so.
Yeah. Well, I think in that case, you can get abstract with it, like where you don't have to worry about things looking real in like if you make renderings or whatever, but it
Okay.
can be pretty abstract. But that's just my opinion of it. And then you can bring in like lighting and imagery and stuff, and you can like really just like collage it up without worrying about whether or not that rendering looks real or not. Just with yeah, trash everywhere, overgrowth, like the brutalist of like you know, cheap construction techniques, and then the trash buildings, or like buildings just made out of scraps and stuff, to like really tell a story. I know I like mentioned like a couple of weeks ago we talked and you hadn't touched Blender yet, so that's cool that you've already like accomplished like stuff with that. But of like, and it's out of my wheelhouse as far as like programming skills, but like programming generative structures or like systems, it's either like through code or whatever, like maybe AI, some kind of stuff that like just runs like simulations of like this falls apart, something else grows on top of it, like this happens, that happens, to like really provide like the mess that could be the future.
Right. Yeah, I think that would be cool.
I don't know.
This is my first time doing a thesis review. I haven't even done a real thesis, so I don't.
I don't know. I think as an architect, I would like to see you go beyond creating the, as you said, the atmosphere or right, the feeling of it.
Mhm.
I wonder, I mean, it would be great. I mean, you have an interest in the kind of a technosphere that could very well be part of the architectural or his future of architecture, right?
Mhm.
So it would be great, I think, if you push towards imagining the future of architecture. And even if you, I mean, the issue of scale, you talked about how it already exists within this genre of investigations. So it doesn't have to be a large scale investigation, but I would really encourage you to think about kind of a multimedia, mixed media, architecture and media together construct of sorts. I think it's really very rich and fertile and promising as an architectural investigation. So for it to stay only in the realm of exploring or capturing the feeling, you've already done that. I
Okay.
think you've already achieved that. So I think it'd be great if you explore what does it mean in architecture.
Mhm.
You're at a position now that you could push it to that level of investigation and think about to make it happen, to make it meaningful in architecture. It might not be you as an architect alone, but you could imagine who else should I have working with me. You might need engineers. Don't be afraid of asking people to talk with you or even partner with you. I don't know what's possible, but I would highly encourage you to do that. To have people of the right disciplines that would make it possible in architecture. Surround yourself with those people. I'm just saying because I've done that since I left Buffalo and my life has been enriched 100 times. I think, no, honestly, I mean, I'm working with all kinds of engineers now. People from different disciplines. And so together we can push things much farther than if we just sit and imagine. And I hope I'm making sense to you, but
Yeah, you are.
be bold and don't be afraid of what others might think, whether or not it is architecture, whether or not it's film. I'm not sure, but it is a one-of-a-kind chance. I mean, you won't get this chance once you enter the world of practicing architect, right? I would imagine that you would have the interest. So I'm suggesting that you surround yourself with people who might push you further, but always grounded in architecture.
Right.
Some points of like what the future could like practically become that a lot of the movies that you studied didn't really touch on because they just didn't know about it. Two things I'm thinking of specifically is like, one is drones, and like using drones as like the transport for anything, and then also virtual reality and mixed reality. Like the 1984 or whatever. I'm mixing up all the movies. There's like some movies with all the advertisements everywhere in like LA and like
Blade Runner.
Blade Runner, that's what I'm thinking of. And like even like the newer Blade Runner, which was like visually spectacular, and all these like holograms that were like, the size of skyscrapers walking around and stuff. And like I've imagined like that, in a dystopian future, like we like physically cannot, like our eyes don't have space that isn't an advertisement. Like companies buy up like all of the sky, they buy up like all of the faces of every building, and like everything's just sold out. So that everything is just like advertisement. And I don't know the link of it now, but I'll send it to you later. There's a video story that somebody made. It's all first person and it's mixed reality, where this person is like an Instacart shopper, because like that's the only job that they can find in the future. And they're like walking around, and their reality is glitching out because their headset is glitching out, and it's like causing them like physical pain and stress. And they're in a grocery store at one point, and everything's like really beautiful, but their headset breaks and it shuts off. And then you see the real world, and it's all gray and dingy and desaturated, and there's like babies crying and stuff. And like there's just a bunch of kind of like QR code type things like all over the walls that the advertisements then get mapped onto once the headset reboots itself.
Mhm.
So like that isn't exactly post-apocalyptic, because it's still assuming that there's like systems set up that can run all of that kind of stuff, but it is definitely dystopian. Yeah, so VR and drones, I think like could shape buildings in ways that like our buildings they're not set up currently.
So keep kind of to build on that. So thanks for inviting me. And I saw this at midterm. So like what I love about this directed research is its breadth. Like you have explored many different things, and you're kind of like, you have an entire list of things. And maybe just as more on the next practical steps, is like to kind of go into one specific thing, or like to define like one thing that you perhaps want to engage in. And so like certain things that I saw is like the everyday, right? And how do you kind of like reinvent or reimagine the everyday? So or is it really like this imagining the future, or is it really imagining the vertical, like and I think it's not to say that once you go into one realm you forget about everything else, but like if you go really find one, like this drone, for example, if you're to go into drones, like I think Mark's example for Liam's project is like a perfect example, where he dives into one very specific case study and really explores so many different things about like, you know, how we consume, how like transport, like all these interconnected things that I think once you have that vision, then like you can then kind of begin like that process of consolidating like all your research, and then some of the stuff might stay on the side, but you know, it gives you like a really narrow framework in which to like build out your thesis.
I'll try to jump in. I think thank you for all this. It's really interesting. It's also quite it's quite a wallop of information, and thanks to I think the comprehensiveness of the catalog, you know, trying to get us through. I think there's a kind of space that you produced that was quite relentless in your presentation, which may be something that you could lean on in further iterations of either presentation, or there was the allusion to multimedia space. But I'd like to propose that you've already produced a kind of space in your presentation, which is arguably dystopic. It was relentless without hope. It was the all-consuming catalog. It was the city of film. You know, it was the scaleless without ornament. You know, urban kind of, I don't know, junk space thing. I don't know. So I think there's kind of I don't know. When I hear I kind of agree with Albert, and maybe I'll wonder about an alternative as well. Is like what happens when you don't consolidate exactly. What happens when you and maybe this is back to Shadi's a little point earlier, and I have a couple questions that I think are really provocative along toward your work, which is like, does architecture have to be implicated in this thesis? Is it really a question of what architecture can do? I mean, I totally get that, but maybe as a non-functioning architect, I'm really curious about your space, which you really articulated as film, right? The dystopic film is the subject, and later on you talked about cities. You talked about the unmoored city. You talked about the unmade city, and the heightened city or something like that. So there was a kind of skirting of architecture. There was a kind of instrumentalization of architecture to talk about film. I wonder, I was really, I'm still a little bit confused, if I'm honest, with the tools that you're moving forward with. There's this like abundant catalog that I would like, that you kind of gathered, I don't know, tools that I think are really interesting. And I really like the kind of tentative move to apply those tools to a place like Hayes Hall, which we know intimately. And I wonder which tools would, you know, the ones that you applied felt kitsch to me. But I wonder if enough of the applications of other tools are kind of continuing to mine how any of these over-sexualization of space would you know, make dystopic Hayes Hall, or, you know, trash, or I really appreciate that kind of, or I appreciate that you want to go to the city scale and also at this intimate scale, but I don't see that bridge quite yet.
Okay.
I might also add one of the couple points in which were really which moved me, which were the unpacking of special effects from what was real. So the humans were running across a frame, and then the special effects were added, and the city was added. So there were like 3 or 4 layers. So I would be kind of curious to know how you reintroduce things like the real body. Do you actually perform? Do you get a bunch of people together and have them running through the building on top of effects? You know, I'm actually really interested in you going down the really technical route and reproducing effects. Shadi said beyond atmosphere, but I'm like, well, what if you tunneled down into atmosphere, and that was enough of an architecture, that was enough of a scope for a thesis. I don't know. I feel I may be always a little bit. It's hard. This is a really hard format because you have a whole other term, and I hesitate to give more reference, but I find myself quite anxious about where you are right now. That maybe one last point, and I don't want to take too much time, but I wonder if there's a place for a kind of hopeful anxiety moving forward, and maybe that's where architecture enters in. There's like, okay, if we're alienated by the present, we don't want to go to a nostalgic past. We want to like move tentatively, hopefully, into a future using the dystopic as a tool. How do we do that? Does architecture play a role, or is it, I don't know. I'm still looking for the hope, the glimmer. Maybe that's where architecture comes in, Shadi. I don't know.
Well, let me respond to that. I mean, I didn't mean to go beyond atmosphere as if architecture does not create it. What I meant was create that atmosphere through language of architecture and through the means and alphabet of architecture, for the lack of better word. But I think that atmosphere is already there in the sense that your catalog is very, you've built a really nice catalog of different techniques and different means of giving that kind of creating that kind of dystopic atmosphere. But you do it through a collection of films and a few, well, you had examples of architecture in the grain elevators, for example, and so on. But I think it's more on the film side, and I would love to see it in a way come back to architecture. That's what I meant. But the atmosphere is already definitely recognized and highlighted.
So thank you for all of this. I do have to, we're at the 5-minute mark. I do have to transition to our final moment of this year event, which is to ask Sakina and all the other students to please leave the call. Sakina, we'll catch up with you immediately following on your usual Zoom call that we usually have for your thesis meetings. So we'll join you there. We'll join you there in a few minutes.
Okay.
And wonderful feedback. I mean, I think the conversation could obviously continue for quite some time.